Roundtable. I would just ask if you have any questions, you can list them in the Q&A. You can introduce yourself in the chat box if you'd like. And with that, I'd like to thank Eric Ewing for hosting us today for our tour of the Great Plains Black History Museum, and then a great discussion. I'm really looking forward to it. It was very kind of you to offer to do this, Eric. And with that, let's go on our adventure.
All right, thank you guys, everyone, for joining us today. And I'd like to welcome you to the Great Plains Black History Museum. We're located at 22. This is what I usually pause so you can get a pencil and jot that address down. We're located at 2221 North 24th Street. Right now, we're not open for regular business. We do schedule small tours of groups of no larger than 8. Face masks are required during the tour. Things I'd like to share with you guys to start off with: the mission of the Great Plains Black History Museum is to preserve, celebrate, and educate all people of the contributions and achievements of African Americans throughout the Great Plains and throughout America. Today, what we're going to be taking a look at, first exhibit we'll take a look at will be the Black citizenship in the age of Jim Crow. We'll take a look at another exhibit called Hate, the other's called Hope. We'll take a look at an exhibit that's been modified and reduced down in size. It's called 24th and Glory, focusing on African-American athletes in the city of Omaha. We'll take a look at a smaller exhibit that's been modified as well, influential African-American women. And then we will take a look, we'll wrap it up by taking a look at the Black experience through the lens of Rudy Smith. And then we'll open up for Q&A. So if you have any questions, please make sure you put them in the Q&A box. If nothing else, we'll go ahead and we will get started. Once I turn my camera around. Black citizenship in the age of Jim Crow. This exhibit focuses on the history of African Americans as post-Civil War, but as you see here, it talks about fighting to belong. Ever since Blacks were brought to the country, brought to America, we have been fighting to belong. Over 401 years ago, when the first Black slaves were brought to the U.S. or brought to North America, we have been fighting to belong. In 1857, the Dred Scott case was a case where an African-American sued for his freedom, and his case reached all the way up to the Supreme Court. And unfortunately, the justice decided against him being a free individual, saying that he could not sue because he was not a citizen. Furthermore, they ruled that no African American could ever be a U.S. citizen. Every war and every battle that this country has fought in, Blacks have been a part of. The first person to die for America's independence was of African descent. His name was Crispus Attucks, and that was in the New England area. We fought in the Civil War, and that was basically because in order for the North to win, or the Union to win, Abraham Lincoln realized that he had to bring Blacks into the war to bring a victory to the Union. In 1860, Abraham Lincoln became the president of the United States. And in 1863, he signed what was known as the Emancipation Proclamation, or should I say, it took effect in 1863. He actually signed the Emancipation Proclamation on September 22nd, 1862. Now, most people think that granted freedom to all slaves. It granted freedom to slaves who were in states that had seceded from the Union. So if you were enslaved in a state that had not seceded from the Union, then those individuals were still enslaved. It wasn't until the 13th Amendment in 1865 which permanently abolished slavery. But it did not change the decision on Dred Scott barring blacks from becoming American citizens. It wasn't until 1870, the 15th Amendment to the Constitution extended suffrage to black men, basically granting them citizenship and the opportunity to vote. After the war ended, began what's known as the Reconstruction period, and that period ran from 1865 to 1877. During that time, there were a lot of strides and accomplishments amongst black citizens. What you're looking at here is Hiram Revel. He served as the first black senator in the U.S. And during that time also, there was over 2,000 African Americans that had held various elected positions throughout local and national government. Just like any other citizen, though, once freedom was provided, blacks wanted the same thing that what was promised to everyone else in the Constitution: life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. During this time, a lot of blacks were trying to relocate loved ones that had been sold away and that they had lost connections with, and they wanted to have opportunities to own land, own businesses, and various other things. But there were groups that felt differently, and in 1865, the Klan was established. This was America's first terrorist organization. The robe belonged to a Joseph Stewart of Tennessee. And as you see, this robe was a different color. It wasn't until later on when they went with the white robes. This robe was found in I've been told two different stories. It was found in the floorboard of an attic of a young lady whose grandfather had passed away, and she found it in the attic. I was also told that she found it in the floorboard in the barn of the home that her grandfather had owned. As the Reconstruction period came to an end, it brought on the rise of what was known as the Jim Crow era. The name Jim Crow came from a minstrel performer, a white minstrel performer who went around in blackface, and he acted like a buffoon, basically trying to reflect that that was the image of black men and black people. Also during this time, there was another Supreme Court case that was heard back in 1896, the Supreme Court case on Plessy versus Ferguson. This case addressed the issue of equality, and the Supreme Court, it came with their decision that you could be separate, but be equal. And if any of you guys see how school systems are, you know that that's not necessarily how it works. Even with the pandemic that happened, this recent pandemic, and having to close down the schools, you can see the school districts that had the ability to continue to properly educate their children versus the school systems that weren't necessarily able to educate their children. The robe, a question I just saw pop up, the Klan robe was found in a home in the state of Nebraska. During the Jim Crow period, there were areas that were segregated where there were blacks entrances, white entrances, white water fountain, black water fountains, and various other things that was not equal. Also during this period, there was events that basically enslaved a lot of black people, and it was called convict leasing. With convict leasing, police would arrest black men for basically maybe loitering, and that person would get 3 to 5 years for loitering or vagrancy.
Eric?
Yes.
Eric, we've had a question come in before you move too much farther. Somebody asked about the robe. Was that found locally or was that found elsewhere?
Yes, it was found here in the state of Nebraska.
Thank you.
And when I get to the other exhibit, I'll show you guys some numbers on how many Klan members that resided in this state of Nebraska. In 1915, the movie The Birth of a Nation was released. This movie focused on depicting Black men in a negative way that still has an impact to this day. If you're not familiar with the movie, it showed this individual, a white man in blackface, and they would tell stories about Black men raping white women and creating fear and hatred towards the Black men. Again, as I said, which still has a lasting impact today. During the Jim Crow period, there were various other events that happened throughout history, throughout time. World War I occurred. World War II occurred. Again, African Americans were fully invested and participated in that with the purpose of belonging. And as the Jim Crow period came to an end, you had the Civil Rights Act of 1964 and the Voting Rights Act of 1965, which legalized Jim Crow. Now, the question I always ask is, if we had the amendments that passed, which gave people the right to vote, then why, again, almost 100 years later, did we have to then necessarily pass another law addressing the issue of voting? This is a book, if you've ever seen the movie, it was called 12 Years a Slave. The movie focused on an individual named Solomon Northup, who had been kidnapped and taken down south and enslaved for 12 years. What happened to Solomon was not an uncommon practice. He was kidnapped from Washington City back in 1841 and rescued in 1853. He then published his book in 1853. This is the first edition publication of that book, published back in 1853. This is Frederick Douglass' famous speech, "What to the slave is the 4th of July." This is some of Malcolm X's famous quotes. Of course, a quote that most people may be familiar with is called "By any means necessary." And this is Dr. King's famous "I Have a Dream" speech, which was given March 28th of 1963. Excuse me, August 28th of 1963. If you ever get a chance, if you've never read this article, but this is the United Nations, the Universal Declaration of Human Rights. Take an opportunity to read this and then ask yourself, are we practicing what this declaration states? Now, the other exhibit we're going to take a look at is called Hate. And as I tell people, some of the things that we talk about, it may be a little uncomfortable, and it should be. But what I wanted to do is maybe make you think about why and why is this making me uncomfortable, and then maybe have additional conversations along that line. This is a map of the Great Plains of America. Each of these red dots represents a documented lynching of African Americans throughout the Great Plains. There's 174. None of these individuals were ever convicted in a court of law of any crime. In some cases, some of them lost their life. As I tell people, I'm still looking for the law that causes you to lose your life for being uppity. And I'm still looking to see how that can be an offense. Yes, these are lynchings that are on record. Over here is the state, the individual's name, and what they were lynched for. I tell people if it wasn't such a tragic event, it would be comical. Individual lynched because he was uppity. Individual was lynched because he went into a white woman's room. Individual was lynched because he sued a white person. Individual was lynched because he pretended to be white. These are the remains of Will Brown. Will Brown was lynched in Omaha on September 28th of 1919, 100 years ago, almost 101 years ago. This was the mob that was responsible for the lynching and killing of Will Smith. That occurred downtown at the Douglas County Courthouse. This is how the courthouse looked after the mob burnt it and destroyed it. There was estimated over $1 million worth of damage done, and that's $19 million worth of damage done at the time. If you've ever been down to the county courthouse, it looks nothing like that today. Now I say this for the reason is because someone had to get the contract to make the repairs and to fix the facilities. And I could guarantee you that it was not a minority-owned business that got that contract. So there was a potential chance of some of the individuals involved with the destruction of the building, either working for the companies or owning the companies that got the contract to make the repairs. This is Will Brown. Will Brown was accused of raping a white woman, something he could not have done according to his lawyer because he just didn't have the physical ability to do it. He was stricken with arthritis. He was allegedly, as he raped the woman, he helped a perfectly healthy white male off at gunpoint and then ran away afterwards. His arthritis would not have allowed him to hold a gun. His arthritis would not have allowed him to run. But he was lynched and killed on September 28th of 1990. This is the headstone that was provided for his gravesite 90 years after his death. This is the soil that came from the Douglas County Courthouse. Last year, as part of the 100th year commemoration, the Great Plains Black History Museum, along with a few other organizations, collaborated with an organization called the Equal Justice Initiative, and they're located in Montgomery, Alabama. And with that, the Equal Justice Initiative, what they've done is they've documented as many of the lynchings, terroristic lynchings, as I refer to them, that have occurred throughout America. And at their museum, they have soil from all the locations that have provided the soil on display in jars such as these. If you were to go down there, that the wall runs about from here to here, and there are individual jars with the person who was lynched, the city and state, and the date in which the lynching occurred. They also have an outdoor exhibit which has canisters that look like caskets. And these canisters are hanging. And on the canister, it has the name of the state. It has the county and the individual who was lynched, and they're hanging. And they start off at eye level. And as you walk through, they start to rise. And when you get to the middle of the building, they hang, and they look sort of like these individual squares hanging above us here. This is a quilt. Yes.
Somebody was wondering at what cemetery is the headstone at for Will Brown?
Well, it's outside of the Forest Lawn Cemetery, I believe on State Street. It's not in the cemetery. It was in the Potter's Field. But yeah, that's where it's located.
Thank you.
All right. This is a quilt that was made to recognize the 150 African-American women who have been lynched throughout history. And as it says here, out of those 150 women that were lynched, 4 of them were pregnant. In one case, they hung the woman up, they cut her stomach open, the fetus fell to the ground, it cried, and they bashed its head in. This is Tom Dennison. Tom Dennison was the mob boss during the time in which Will Brown was lynched and killed. He was the one that created a lot of hate and discontent amongst people. Some of the rhetoric that he used, you probably would hear that today. Statements such as they're taking our jobs, because this was also the time in which World War I was coming to an end. And some of the soldiers that had fought were coming back, and they wanted to just assume normalcy, and they wanted their jobs back. And so they created a us against them type situation, and they caused a lot of problems. He also had some of his henchmen who would go around in blackface and rape white women, and then black men would be blamed for it. And the newspaper would refer to black men as the big black beast. Now, this was in 1919. Sometimes when you listen to the news, you hear that similar type fear mongering. This is Will Brown's death certificate. And it lists on here the cause of death, bullet wounds through body. But of course, he was hung, burnt, shot, drugged through the streets of downtown Omaha. This was the National Guard that they called out in response to everything that was going on. And as I just said, the events happened downtown, in downtown Omaha. They called out the National Guard, and they posted the National Guard at 24th and Lake, which is basically about 2 miles away from where the rioting and things were occurring. So they didn't call the National Guard out to necessarily address what was happening downtown. They called the National Guard out just in case blacks were to retaliate against the things and events that were occurring and going on. This was the newspaper article that was ran the day after. And it talks about here, the mob in Omaha lynches Negro. Even in death, he couldn't get a name. But they also attempted to hang the mayor, Mayor Smith. And the reason they attempted to hang the mayor was when Mayor Smith ran for office, he ran on getting rid of gambling, getting rid of alcohol, and getting rid of prostitution, which would have impacted Tom Dennison's livelihood, being that that's how he made his living. This was the inside of the courthouse. And some of the bullet holes are still there, and the bullets are still lodged in the inside the building. It's just been kind of painted over. This is a picture of Women Klan taken back in 1931, excuse me. We'll talk about this particular photo a little bit later. This is a Klan certificate that was given to members once they became members of the Klan. This individual, his occupation, he was a judge. In 1920s in Nebraska, there were roughly about 45,000 Klan members that lived in the state of Nebraska. In Lincoln alone, there were over 5,000 members. This exhibit is called Hope. This is a photo of Malcolm X with his daughter. A photo of Malcolm X and Dr. King. And this was a pencil drawing that was donated to the museum featuring Dr. King, Malcolm X, Frederick Douglass, and President Obama. Now I'm going to ask a question. You don't have to answer just yet, but what do all four of these individuals have in common with the city of Omaha? Were you guys aware that the first African-American film company was started right here in Omaha? Back in 1915, it was known as the Lincoln Motion Picture Company. And it was started by the Johnson brothers. The actual house where they started the company at still stands today. It's at 2816 Pratt. It was built in 1909. This is a deed that was signed by Frederick Douglass. And this is a letter that was given to a community representative signed by President Obama. You know, a lot of times people ask a question, so what did Omaha do during the Civil Rights Movement? Now, first of all, I always like to preface that with, there's been a Civil Rights Movement for 401 years. It just got coined the term Civil Rights Movement in the 1940s through the 1960s. But Omaha played their part in the Civil Rights Movement. Everyone is aware of Rosa Parks and what occurred with her and her refusing to give up her seat on the bus. Well, years before that happened, we boycotted and protest the bus based on civil rights issues as well. But now we didn't boycott the buses because of where we could sit. We boycotted the buses and the streetcars on the hiring practices of those organizations, because they would not hire Blacks to drive the buses or the streetcars. A group that was responsible for this was called the DePores Club. And they actually started on the campus of Creighton University in mid-1940s, but they were deemed to be a little too radical for the times. And so unfortunately, they were dismissed off the campus of Creighton. They were started by Denny Holland, who's in this picture, and Father McCord, along with other individuals, and then Black individuals from the North Omaha community. Once they were dismissed off the campus of Creighton, they had a little spot over here in the North Omaha area, and they also worked out of the Omaha Star. The individuals that you see in this picture here is Mrs. Bertha Calloway, Denny Holland, Father McCord, and Dorothy Urey, again, who are all part of the DePores Club. Now, with the boycotting of the buses and the streetcars, what they did with that, and they told people, if you have to ride the bus or you have to ride the streetcar, pay your fare with pennies. And the reason they wanted you to pay your fare with pennies, because it would show support of the boycott. It would also slow the driver down by basically, because each time you dropped the coin in there, he had to manipulate the machine to count the coin. So at the time, I think the fare was 10 to 18 cents. So if you were paying with pennies and there were 3 or 4 people paying with pennies, it would slow the bus down and throw it off schedule. So they did that. The bus and the streetcar companies, they changed their hiring practices and start hiring black people to employing black people. They also boycotted a big ice cream company known as Reed's Ice Cream. Now, the black community was one of the biggest participant in their ice cream or purchasers of their ice cream, but yet they wouldn't have blacks working for them. So they boycotted them and forced them to change their hiring practices. Also, Coca-Cola. Coca-Cola would allow us to purchase a Coke and a Smile, but they wouldn't allow us to be the deliverer of the Coke and a Smile. And so they boycotted the Coca-Cola company. Coca-Cola then changed their hiring practices as well. And then there was a big laundry service in the North Omaha area that would wash our clothes, but it wouldn't allow us to work there to wash the clothes. So matter of fact, the owners even made the statement of, we'll go out of business before we'll hire one of those. And the community allowed them to go out of business. So Omaha played its part during the Civil Rights Movement. There was also a group known as the 4 C's, and I can never remember what each of those C's stand for, so I don't even try to. But the 4 C's group was teenagers who protested and boycotted, well, I should say in this case, protested the integration of Peony Park. Peony Park would not allow black people to swim at the swimming pool, and they went so far, even when the city made it a requirement to integrate, they became a private organization or a private club, and the white patriots that didn't like having to pay additional money to be part of the club, and so they stopped going as well. So then they changed their practices and ended up opening up the swimming pool to all participants. This is a painting of Malcolm X. When we first relocated down to this building that we're in now, I was going to put this in storage because I didn't necessarily think it depicted Malcolm good enough, but my wife convinced me to display it. And so to help, I initially had put an X in front of it, but the X became blocked because I had my dad build me storage cabinets to block the X. So then I ended up turning around and putting a copy of his birth certificate on display. And of course, Malcolm was born May 19th, 1925. This is a painting that was donated to the museum from the King family. It's a painting of the Buffalo Soldiers. The 9th and 10th Cavalry were stationed out in western Nebraska, and they also served as America's first park rangers. They got their name. There's 2 different stories on how they got their name, Buffalo Soldiers. One story says that the Native Americans, when they saw them, they saw their woolly black hair and their brown skin, and so that's why they called them Buffalo Soldiers. Another story says that, like a buffalo, when cornered, a buffalo fights fiercely to survive and to live on, and they saw that in black soldiers, and so that's why they were named the Buffalo Soldiers. Now, this chess set came from Mombasa, Kenya. I got that back in 1980, 85, 86 time frame, and I donated it to the museum because I thought it matched the table's color really well. Yeah, but it's made of soapstone. This is a flight suit. This flight suit is from the first African-American to fly around the world solo. And he was also, at the time, he was the youngest person to ever do so. His name is Captain Barrington Irving. He's not from Omaha, but he visited Omaha a few different times, and I had a chance to meet him and ask him to donate a flight suit. He's actually from Florida. The next exhibit you're going to take a look at is called 24th and Glory, which features Johnny Rodgers' Heisman Trophy. This is actually his trophy. He allows us to display it at the museum, and whenever he needs it, he just comes and picks it up, and then he brings it back to the museum. When he first offered for us to display it at the museum, I actually kind of went back into childhood, and I was just so excited that he was going to allow us to display it, that when I left his office, I called my wife up to tell her that Johnny was going to let us display his trophy, and my wife's response was, and I had to explain to her the significance of it, and she still said, well, I guess that's pretty good. Now, Omaha has a rich history when it comes to sports, and in particular, Black athletes. We have representation in 3 of the 5 major sports Hall of Fames. We have representation in the Baseball Hall of Fame in Bob Gibson, who was a pitcher for the St. Louis Cardinals. He was the MVP of the World Series back in 1964. He also was one of the reasons in which they changed the height of the pitcher's mound. The pitcher's mound used to be higher, but he threw the ball so hard and so fast that it made it difficult for the batters to hit. And so they had to reduce the height of it, which took some of the speed and the power away from his pitching, which allowed people to have a better chance of hitting the ball. We also have representation in the Football Hall of Fame in Gale Sayers, the first African-American to start at quarterback in the NFL, was from Omaha, Marlon Briscoe. We also have representation in the Basketball Hall of Fame in Bob Boozer. He was also Olympic gold medal winner. Again, we have a Heisman Trophy winner, and then we have a world championship boxer. The next exhibit you're going to take a look at has been reduced down in size during the month of March through mid-May. We have the exhibit on display called Influential African American Women. We put that up in March in honor of Women's History Month. This exhibit focuses on, the larger exhibit focuses on local African American women who've had an impact, and as well as national African American women that have had an impact. This is Judge Pittman. She was the first African American female to graduate from Creighton University Law School, and she then went on to become the first African American judge in the state of Nebraska. Gabrielle Union, who is an actress. Mrs. Mildred Brown, the founder of the Omaha Star, which is the oldest owned and operated African American business in the state of Nebraska. This year, I believe they will be celebrating their 82nd or 83rd anniversary. It's also the oldest owned and operated business by African American woman in the United States. And this is Mrs. Bertha Calloway. It was because of her we're having this tour today. She was the founder of the Great Plains Black History Museum. She founded the museum back in 1975. And Kathy Hughes. Kathy Hughes was the founder of a TV station called TV One and a conglomerate of radio stations called Radio One. She's from Omaha, Nebraska. She's one of the richest African-American women in the country. She's from Omaha. Her father was a CPA, and he actually worked out of the Omaha Star building. And her mom was part of Women Power or Girl Power before it was even a term. She was the lead singer in an all-female band that sung upstairs in the Dreamland Ballroom. Next summer, we'll have an exhibit focusing on her. This is Mr. Rudy Smith. He was a photojournalist for the Omaha World Herald. And the exhibit is called The Black Experience Through the Lens of Rudy Smith. This exhibit captures some of his work as a photojournalist. He was the first African-American photojournalist for the Omaha World Herald. And it would have been 14 years that he retired this year. He was the first African-American photojournalist for the Omaha World Herald, and he's been the only African-American photojournalist for the Omaha World Herald. Unfortunately, he passed away December of last year, 2 days prior to finishing his book called The Black Experience Through the Lens of Rudy Smith. But the exhibit focuses on some of his work and some of the photos that he captured. This is a photo of Jesse Jackson when he visited Omaha back in 1988 when he was running for office. He was up in what was known as the Hilltop or Pleasant View projects. One of my summer jobs when I was in college, I was an ice cream truck driver. And my route took me through the Hilltop projects. And that first day through there, you know, there were kids coming up to purchase ice cream. And then there were kids standing back that didn't have money to purchase ice cream. So I was giving them free ice cream. By about Wednesday of that week, I noticed there were less kids buying and more kids standing back, but I continued to give away free ice cream. By the end of the week, I'd given away so much free ice cream that I had given away more ice cream than money I had made. So I realized that that was probably not going to be the job for me. This is a photo in which Rudy captured of Robert Kennedy back in 1968. This photo is also at the Smithsonian Museum. This photo was taken 2 weeks prior to the assassination of Robert Kennedy. Now, I know with all the turmoil and things that are going on, you might ask, where did this happen? Well, this is a photo that was taken back in 1969 during the riots here in Omaha in 1969. These riots occurred because a 14-year-old girl was shot in the back of her head by a police officer. Her crime was playing music in an empty apartment. It was at the Logan Fontenelle projects, and the way the apartments were set up were they all connected as far as on the electrical grid. And so even if an apartment was vacant, you couldn't shut off the power to it because it would impact all of the homes that were on that same grid. So the young kids knew that, so they would go into and they would take their portable record players and they go in and they listen to music. On the day in which Vivian Strong was shot and killed, it was June 24th of 1969, was shot and killed. They were in one of the apartments playing music. They weren't vandalizing, weren't causing any destruction, but someone called the police. The police officer responded. The kids were running out the back door, and while running away, she was shot in the back of her head, which sparked off the riot of 69. Rudy captured this photo, and in capturing this photo, he almost lost his life because as he was taking the photo, the National Guardsman asked him what he was doing out there, and he explained to him what he was doing. And he said that the National Guardsman said, let's take this behind the building and shoot him in his head. And Rudy said if it wasn't for the fact that he saw the mayor and a few other people across the street that he yelled out to, they would have taken him behind the building and would have shot and killed him. This was a photo taken in 1964 NAACP demonstration. This photo was taken as part of a piece that Rudy took relating to poverty back in 1971. This was a photo that was taken on the Civil Rights March in 1968. In this photo, Rudy captured Johnny Rogers, Marlon Briscoe, Bob Boozer, and Gail Sayers. He captured a group of students back in 1964, standing by for a parade to recognize Bob Gibson after he'd won the World Series. on October 16th of 1964. Omaha has a real rich history as it relates to music. The building we're in right now is known as the Jewel Building. Upstairs was the home of the Dreamland Ballroom. This is a photo that was taken of Luigi Waits. And this is a photo that was taken of B.B. King, along with his guitar, Lucille. Okay, now I'm going to go back to my seat there, and I'll open it up for questions because that's pretty much the end of the tour.
So, Eric, we do have a few questions. We will start with, whoops, lost it. Here we go. You said earlier 150 women were lynched, and the question is, was that across the country or was that individually?
Across the country. Across the country. And when I say these are documented lynchings. There were numerous of undocumented lynchings. You know, and if it was just one, it would be one too many.
Mm-hmm. Absolutely. Thank you.
Especially when it's you know, there's been no, you know, the legal system hasn't played a role in anything.
Mm-hmm.
So.
Thank you. Let's see. How do you think slavery affects Black America today?
Well, I did mention during Jim Crow era, there was a thing called prison leasing or convict leasing. It still plays a role in today. And, you know, I think it still shades maybe some people's opinion. Again, you have to depict, you have to see how Black people are depicted. You know, it's interesting how when Blacks were enslaved, they were such hard workers. After they gained their freedom, they were depicted as being shady and lazy. But when for 100, 200 plus years, when they were making other people money, they weren't shady and lazy.
An interesting point. Yes, thank you. What was the name of Rudy's book?
The Black Experience Through the Lens of Rudy Smith.
The Black Experience Through the Lens of Rudy Smith. Great.
And we do have that. I'm going to do a shameless plug. We do have that on sale here at the museum.
Very good. Shameless plugs are absolutely welcome. We appreciate you doing this. Okay, and Julie says, thank you, Mr. Ewing. What are the major priorities and opportunities for collaboration with the museum?
Well, I'm always looking for opportunities to work with other organizations, to collaborate on different events. As I like to share with people, though, I look to create win-win situations for anybody participating in a collaboration. I don't want it to be where the Great Plains benefits and then the other organization that we're collaborating gains nothing, because if that happens, then we don't collaborate in the future. So whatever we do, I'm looking to create a situation where it's beneficial for all parties.
Mm-hmm. Excellent.
Because I want to create, as I say, relationships versus one-time events.
Absolutely. Thank you. And for people who are interested, Abby has put the title of the book in the chat. Make sure you get that from the museum if you can. Amy Sandos says, thank you very much for this presentation and tour. She looks forward to visiting the museum in person. Are people able to do in-person visits right now?
Yeah, we're doing small groups no larger than 8. Masks are required and it's by appointment. And the exhibits that you see on display today, we try to change out our exhibits every 2 to 3 months. The only permanent exhibit is the Hate and the Hope. Our next coming up exhibit in August will be the Negro League baseball exhibit, and then we'll also towards the end of August we'll have the March on Washington exhibit.
Very good. Okay, let's see. those are all the questions that I'm seeing that that you haven't, everything else has been answered. So that's fantastic. This has been wonderful. I love the museum. I've been several times, and I really loved this walkthrough with your, I haven't had the fortune of your narration before, so I've really appreciated that.
Yeah. Well, and I hope, I try to make sure that the information that I've shared is accurate information and that it's beneficial information. And I intentionally create some discomfort in the conversation because I want people to think. And then, because even if you're not a perpetrator of any wrongdoing, whether it's against a minority, whether it's against gender or whatnot, by not saying anything, you are participating because you're letting it happen. And so I think the only way, if it's making you uncomfortable, it's making you uncomfortable for a reason. And so, no one likes to be discomfort. So if you don't, then say something, do something that way that gets that feeling away from you, and you don't have to carry that particular burden of I should have spoken up. I should have said something.
Absolutely. I'm seeing several people just saying thank you so much. This was wonderful. Yes, this recording we have recorded this, so this will be available once we get it ready for sharing. Fantastic tour. Abby put the address of the Great Plains Black History Museum in the chat for anybody that needs it. And with that, I guess we'll hand it back over to you, Ann.
Okay. Yeah. I just have one more thing to say. I just want to say that if some of you guys are on here and you have your departments or your organizations that'd like to maybe do a virtual tour, I'd be happy to provide that as well. So just let me know.
Thanks, Eric. That's great.
You're welcome.
Well, this has just been probably one of the best hours I've spent in a long time. It was so interesting and educational. I like to think I'm a pretty good student of history, but I learned a whole lot here. And so thank you so much. We're going to continue to occasionally have these pop-up tours of some of our members so we can learn more about the work that they do. And with that, everybody join me in giving a virtual round of applause to Eric. And thank you all very much.
Thank you guys. Appreciate you.
Appreciate you. Take care.
You too.